Dr. David Bentley Hart.
Well, that was fun. Could you go on? Thank you for having me here. I am always glad to come back to New Orleans, even if only for a few days. I've been living in South Bend, Indiana for the past couple of years, and for a Marylander, to be away from seafood for quite that long is a sore trial of the spirit. And so getting here is a liberation. Normally I wouldn't travel this time of year, postseason baseball and all. For those who are interested, in the top of the seventh, the Dodgers are leading the Nationals 4-3. But I better set that aside. This talk, in a sense, is a broad overview of a project. I can't pretend that I'm going to offer a single, seamless, or complete case for what interests me, simply because I want to give some sense of what I've been working on at NDIAS, at Notre Dame, the other Notre Dame, the one with the somewhat larger football program. Catholicism is also a religion there, I understand, but so far I haven't seen anything like the same devotion, but I've been working on this project for some time, and not alone either. I've benefited greatly from philosophers, theologians, cognitive scientists there, people in physics and evolutionary biology. The cognitive scientists can be the most annoying. Good people, but it always takes them a little extra time to figure out the difference between cognitive science and the question of consciousness. But once they get it, they're quite tractable. So let me just sort of try to describe the issues that I'm working on and the train of reflections that in a more rigorous form will appear in the book that emerges from the work I'm doing at Notre Dame, and that was adumbrated in, not my last book, but the one before that, in a long passage on a long chapter on consciousness. To anyone whose knowledge of philosophical and religious intellectual history extends back more than, say, 3 or 4 centuries, let me start by saying, what often seems most curious about current debates regarding philosophy of mind or philosophy of consciousness, or even the nature of the soul, depending on what angle you're approaching it from, can be the narrowness of the intellectual range they exhibit. We're all inheritors of a picture of reality shaped by the mechanistic metaphysics of early modernity. We, and as such today, are confronted by a somewhat preposterous dilemma when we attempt to make sense of the reality of intentional, unified consciousness, the first-person perspective that is in each of us the I, who says, I think. Within the mechanical narrative, matter is no more than mindless mass, and physical causality no more than mindless force. And so the causal power of, say, conceptual abstractions or volitions or final purposes creates a considerable theoretical problem, one that seems to allow of only 2 possible solutions in the modern framework. Either some version of Cartesian dualism, in which the body is a machine centrally operated by an immaterial homunculus called the soul, or a thoroughgoing mechanical monism in which mind or soul is an emergent result or epiphenomenon of unguided physical events. Between the high, grim escarpments of these 2 options, there's really only a very narrow pass. And trapped as they are in this defile, many materialist philosophers or neuroscientists naturally assume that if they can only dispose of the Cartesian soul once and for all, they will have by default established the supremacy of the physicalist position. And they also naturally assume that to chase that fabulous and anxiously alert little imp away, They need only find a sufficient number of instances in which the brain operates without immediately conscious supervision on the part of any purely rational, cognizant agency within. Moments, that is, when the homunculus appears to be asleep at the controls, for then they'll have proved that everything, mind included, is only a form of mechanism after all. The Benjamin Libet experiments on free will were an early example of this, conceptually confused, but famous. There really is a certain poignancy at times about the spectacle of cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind, those who are really materialists, exerting themselves to tear down the Cartesian partition, separating body from mind in the hope of demonstrating that after all there really is no wonderful wizard to be found on the other side pulling the levers. But alas, the mechanistic paradigms within which they operate condemn them to a very simple and dialectically inescapable choice. If they are not to believe in a ghost mysteriously animating a machine, then they must make themselves believe in a machine miraculously generating a ghost. And the inconvenient problem bedeviling the project is that the reduction of consciousness to mechanical causes is probably empirically and logically impossible. Occasionally, even a materialist scientist will recognize this, but it's Christoph Koch would be an example of one of the greatest neuroscientists alive, who wrote their magisterial volume on the science of consciousness from the perspective of emergentism, emerging from neurological complexity. He has come to conclude that this was all a misguided project and that consciousness isn't reducible to the machinery of the brain. But instead of embracing the alternatives that might naturally occur to some of us or not, he has embraced a kind of panpsychism, which I'll explain below, which simply says everything is already conscious, so stop asking. But in those, but think about what we do when we think. In those moments of wonder with which we are confronted by the strangeness or the fortuity and the pure givenness of things, we're confronted by two mysteries. No less wonderful than the existence of things is our consciousness of them, our ability to know the world, to possess a continuous subjective awareness of reality, to mirror the unity of being in the unity of a private cognizance, to assume each moment of experience into a fuller comprehension of the whole, and to relate ourselves to the world through acts of judgment and will. Actually, I just need the clock on here. I'm not checking the scores. In a single movement of thought, the mind is capable of receiving the world in both its integrity and its diversity, of holding past, present, and future together, of contemplating reality at once under both its particular and general aspects, of composing endless imaginative and conceptual variations upon experience, of pondering itself as it ponders the world, and all that while preserving the limpid and silent presence to itself in which it indivisibly abides. Being is transparent to mind, mind to being. Each is fitted to the other, open to the other, containing and contained by the other. Each is the mysterious glass in which the other shines. Now, to a convinced materialist, all of this must be wholly physical in nature and probably entirely mechanical in the broadest sense. Even if the science as yet eludes us, consciousness must be explicable entirely in terms of the interaction between our neural constitution and the concrete world around us. Of course, even the materialist should be willing to grant that the powers of the mind can't be exhaustively accounted for solely in terms of the mechanics of sensory stimulus and neurological response, if only because neither stimulus nor response is by itself a mental phenomenon. Neither is a purely physical reality, neither, as a purely physical reality, possesses conceptual content, intentional meaning, or personal awareness. In truth, though, even the most basic phenomenology of consciousness discloses so vast an incommensurability between physical causation and mental events that no purely physical explanation of their relation is likely to succeed for simple methodological reasons. There is so absolute a qualitative abyss between the objective facts of neurophysiology and the subjective experience of being a conscious self that any method capable of providing a model of only the former can never produce an adequate causal narrative of the latter. A correlative narrative, but not a causal one, perhaps. The two sides of the phenomenon cannot be collapsed into a single observable datum or even connected to one another in a clear causal sequence, and so the precise relation between them can't be defined or even isolated as an object of scientific scrutiny. And this is an epistemological limit that it seems reasonable to think may never be erased, no matter how sophisticated our knowledge of the complex activities of the brain may become. We'll never be able to examine from any objective vantage the simple act of thought in its proper aspect, the conscious awareness of a subject. But the problems with the materialist account of consciousness are far graver than the limits of scientific method. And I'm afraid here I'm going to have to summarize because each of these topics deserves a talk unto itself. For one thing, though, let me start. Absolutely central to the mechanistic vision of reality is the principle that material forces are inherently mindless, intrinsically devoid of purpose, and therefore only adventitiously and accidentally directed towards any end, and that, when assumed into composite structures whose essentially disparate parts, as a result of design or chance, operate together in some kind of functional order. And if complex rational order is extrinsic to what matter essentially is, how much more so must rationality itself be as an act? For consciousness would appear to be everything that, according to the principles of mechanism, matter is not: directed, purposive, essentially rational. Thus, the best materialist interpretation of consciousness is likely ever to be able to offer will be an increasingly precise index of correlations between mental phenomena and discrete electrochemical events in the cerebral cortex without any causal narrative to mediate between them. How any combination of diverse material forces, even when fortuitously gathered into complex neurological systems, can add up to the simplicity and immediacy of consciousness, to its openness to the physical world, to its reflective awareness of itself, to the liberty of its conceptual and imaginative powers from the constraints of material circumstance. Well, and this I say with a sigh of resignation, bred from years of reading Steven Pinker. That will just have to remain an enigma, explained away by, at best, vague gestures in the direction of the mysterious, emergent, and remember that word, emergent properties generated by the cumulative complexity of the modular brain. Of course, my friend's trying to tell me what the score is. Doesn't help either on my phone, sorry. And this understanding of emergence is not conspicuously different from a belief in magic. In this instance alone, the essential aimlessness of matter achieves so intense and intricate a concentration of its various random forces that all at once it is fantastically inverted into the virtual opposite of everything modern orthodoxy tells us matter is. This is why Christoph Koch and others have abandoned their original projects. Somewhere a perfect qualitative difference has been conjured away by a mere accumulation of quantitative complexities. And here's where I say I have to proceed in a very summary fashion. Just recall how many logical difficulties a materialist reduction of mind has been shown to entail in the history of philosophy of mind. The most commonly evoked, especially in the English-speaking world, is the problem of qualia. That is, the qualitative sense of what it is like that constitutes the immediately intuitive form of subjectivity and that poses philosophical difficulties that only multiply the more we seek to resolve them. Or the problem of abstract concepts, which become more dazzlingly difficult to explain the more deeply we consider how entirely they determine our conscious engagement with the world a priori. And of course, there's the problem of reason, which is sort of a classic argument. For to reason about something is to proceed from one premise or proposition or concept to another, in order ideally to arrive at some conclusion in a coherent sequence whose connections are determined by the semantic content of each of the steps taken. But if nature is mechanism, all sequences of physical causes and effects are determined entirely by the impersonal laws governing the material world. One neuronal event can cause another as a result of physical necessity, but certainly not as a result of logical necessity. And the connections among the brain's neurons cannot generate the symbolic and conceptual connections that compose an act of consecutive logic, because the brain's neurons are connected organically and interact physically, not conceptually. Then, of course, there are the two greatest difficulties of all. I'm skipping a few here, but forgive me. But one, intentionality itself, what the great Franz Brentano called the supreme mark of the mental, inseparable from every act of consciousness, the mind's directedness, its aboutness, its capacity for meaning by which it thinks, desires, believes, means, represents, wills, imagines, or otherwise orients itself towards a specific object, purpose, or end. For the mind knows nothing in a merely passive way, but always has an end or meaning towards which it is purposively directed as towards a final cause. And there is absolutely no intentional reciprocity between the mind and the objects of its intentions. Thoughts can be directed towards things, but if the modern picture of nature is true, at least, things cannot be directed towards thoughts. Intentionality is finite and concerned with things under specific aspects, whereas material reality is merely an infinite catenation of accidental events, and so the specific content of the mind's intentions must be determined by consciousness alone. One could never derive the specific meaning of a given physical event from the event itself, not even a brain event, because in itself it means nothing at all, at least proceeding from modern premises. And even the most minute investigation of its physical constituents and instances could never yield the particular significance that the mind represents it as having. So the teleology of intentionality is entirely an act of consciousness towards the world, which is contrary in its sheer phenomenological structure to everything that modern orthodoxy tells us nature is, and yet it can't be derived from nature. And then there's also the transcendental unity of consciousness, which makes such intentionality possible and which poses far greater difficulties for the materialist than the mere neurological binding problem. That is, the question of whether there's an executive module in the brain in which cognitive faculties are organized. Even Kant, who didn't think that the argument from the unity of consciousness could be used to prove the immortality of the soul, which it had, traditionally been invoked to do, even Kant admitted that it made a materialist understanding of consciousness logically insupportable. Anyway, that's just a rough sketch. In the end, there will always remain that essential part of the conscious self that seems simply to stand apart from the spectacle of material causality. Pure perspective, a gaze in upon reality that is itself available to no gaze from beyond itself, known to itself only in its act of knowing what is other than itself. For a scientific culture that believes true knowledge of anything can be gained only by the systematic reduction of that thing to its simplest parts, undertaken from an entirely third-person stance, this inaccessible first-person subjectivity, this indissoluble interiority, impossible to disassemble, reconstruct, or model, yet full of numberless incommunicable qualitative sensations and velleities and intuitions into which no inquisitive eye can ever peer, is so radically elusive a phenomenon that there seems no hope of capturing it in any complete scientific account. But attempts to solve the problem of consciousness in materialist terms have been, vigorous and serious. But even those who engage in them can generally recognize that they inevitably seem to exchange one explanatory deficiency for another. Or even, to be honest, let me say this, apart from the script here, most of them tend not so much to offer a solution to the problem, but simply to restate the problem in a way that momentarily seems to elucidate it, but doesn't. Supervenience theory, for instance, which I'll get to, is a perfect example of restating the problem in such a way that you for a moment don't notice that all you've done is restate the problem. The most daring of these attempts, I have to say, is a line of thought known as eliminativism, which works a series of curious if you've ever heard of Paul and Patricia Churchland, they would be the archpriest and priestess, or priest, these are priests of this. I got to get away from these gendered terms, I'm sorry, even when being witty. The idea of eliminativism works a series of curious variations on the notion that all truths about the world can be entirely reduced to, and so more correctly described by, the facts of physics. The genuine, fully developed eliminativist position, this is not a caricature, I mean, this is really how it goes, is that there really is no such thing as consciousness at all, and that all talk about minds, intentions, ideas, convictions, thoughts, and so forth belongs to the quaintly primitive patois of folk psychology. Ideally, we should be able to dispense with such language altogether and instead speak solely in terms of discrete physical processes and material elements, thus eliminating all pre-scientific allusions to persons and mental events entirely. The Churchlands, try to talk this way in person. They talk about their love life as the exchange of... Never mind. But they only get as far as the biochemical. They still haven't reduced it to physics yet, so yeah. Consciousness and thoughts and the like are just figments of folklore. They have no real existence in themselves, and the eliminativist dream is that one day we will dispense with talk of them altogether in favor of some purely particulate and physically causal description. Now, clearly, I'm not going to go into a long refutation. I mean, for this, I would just say it's little more than the genetic fallacy monstrously amplified into an interminable successions of reductions to absurdity. And its guiding premise, which is the arcane idea that somewhere out there, in principle at least, there exists an infinite narrative of physical particularities that could supplant all references to unified states of consciousness without any empirical remainder, strikes me not so much as audacious as hallucinatory. But what else is to be done? I mean, this is a serious question. I like the eliminativists because I think they're the ones who are thinking most clearly about what materialism requires. There are materialist or naturalist alternatives to eliminativism, but they don't do enough to prevent supernaturalism from creeping back in. One can argue that consciousness is real, but that it emerges from purely physical forces. This, however, creates more questions than it answers. A true physicalism makes no allowance for emergent properties in nature that are all not already implicit in their causes. Unless then one is positing the existence of proto-conscious material elements, and we'll see there are those who do just this, particles of intentionality and awareness that are in some inconceivable way already rational and subjective, and that can add up to the unified perspective of a single conscious subject, one is just talking about some marvelous transition from the undirected, mindless causality of mechanistic matter to the intentional unity of consciousness, which again does not seem conspicuously better than talk of magic. Nor does it improve matters because the phenomenology of consciousness simply does not map onto the metaphysics of matter, of the mechanistic paradigm. Nor does it improve matters to assert that consciousness supervenes in one way or another on material forces. According to this approach, consciousness really exists and really operates through its own inherent properties, and so cannot be eliminated in favor of purely physical descriptions of things. At the same time, however, it's wholly dependent on its material substrate, and there can be no change of state at the level of consciousness without a corresponding change of state at the physical level. But how is that possible? How in physicalist terms could mental events operate as causes in any real sense in this scheme? They'd really only float upon the surface of a stream of physical causality that could not actually be interrupted in its flowing by any power from above. And such a picture of the relation of the physical to the mental, no matter how subtly conceived, would surely have to succumb to the same problems posed by the logical syntax and semantics of rational thought that I mentioned above, the problem of reason. So in what sense is supervenience theory a solution to the relation of mind and body rather than, again, as I said, a mere restatement of the problem? And the answer would be in no sense. Another option is epiphenomenalism, which takes up one of the challenges I just made, and this is a theory that says that consciousness is quite real, that it arises from physical processes, that it is not itself a cause, however, of anything. It is merely a phenomenal residue of processes that it cannot influence. In this view of things, all physical events do belong to a closed causal continuum. There we're sticking close to the mechanistic narrative, the causal closure of the physical. But some of these events have the curious effect of generating the ghostly epiphenomenon of personal consciousness, which, not itself being material, cannot enter back into the continuum from which it arises. Now, this means that though you might imagine that it's your consciousness of desiring to eat a cherry that prompts you to take one from a bowl and place it in your mouth, or your conscious belief in epiphenomenalism that prompts you to say, I believe in epiphenomenalism, nothing of the sort is true, because all of those bodily actions, including those words, belong to the realm of physical causality and occur entirely as a result of physical forces. There are several problems with this theory, however, I think the most obvious of which is that it's self-evidently false. There's no need to be coy here. I mean, your desires, beliefs, ideas, ambitions, plans, hopes, fears, intentions of every kind clearly do play a causal role in your actions. And I honestly, not to be unfair, but I think only a lunatic or a philosopher of mind could doubt this. But I'm not going to make the argument now. I mean, I can make the argument at tedious length. But I think I'm more interested, I'm more impressed by the naturalist version of panpsychism, which I mentioned above. This theory claims that consciousness is not a unique property of organisms with brains, but is a fundamental property of the universe at large, present in all physical reality in some form, perhaps as, say, a natural accompaniment to the exchange of information states that occurs whenever one material reality affects another, so that a thermometer or a coffee spoon could be said to be conscious, presumably at a fairly idiotic level, of a change in room temperature or stirring cream into coffee. Actually, the most recent version, the most up-to-date version of this is integrated information theory, the brainchild, or I don't know if I should put it that way, the child of Giulio Tononi, and it's also been picked up by Christoph Koch. I think it's based on just a linguistic error, confusion about how we use the word information, but it's very powerful. You know, it's a powerful narrative because of the amount of money is generated by grant committees or, funding research into integrated information theory. In this view of things, there is a qualitative and intentional dimension to everything, no less fundamental than the particles of matter, though entirely different from them in nature. Again, though, I would say that I find this a somewhat vacuous approach, at least as a naturalist theory. I mean, if a supernaturalist view of panpsychism I could defend, but here it seems, again, that we're merely repeating the problem, but at an atomic level. We have the same paradox. One and the same atom, say, possesses two contradictory aspects, which are the inversion of one another. Let's be Kantian and call them the nomological and the pathological. That is, one side of this thing, the atom, the side that's bound by physical laws, is mechanistic and empirical. The other, which is possessed of qualitative awareness, is teleological and transcendental. The interaction between the two sides is no less mysterious for being atomized. Now, I have to say that sometimes when I read to Noni and others, I feel as if I've passed through the looking glass and I'm having the critiques of practical reason and of judgment explained to me by Humpty Dumpty. I'm just barely willing to countenance the irresoluble paradox of something being at once an empirical objectivity obedient to mechanistic determinism and also a transcendental subjectivity possessed of intentionality and freedom, but only as applied to myself and other persons. I'm not able to tolerate it as applied to my breakfast cereal. I mean, you know, how in good conscience could I lift my spoon? I'm not going to go ahead with it, but I mean, there are many theories, and there are serious ones. I don't think as yet a paradigm for a mechanistic reduction or for a material reduction of consciousness has even appeared on the horizon. It was much simpler as a question, I think, this entire relation of consciousness and body for the thinkers of antiquity or the Middle Ages, because at that point, body and soul hadn't been divorced from one another, the former reduced to an intrinsically mindless mechanism, the latter to an intrinsically disembodied rational substance, and then forced to work out their differences under terms of settlement dictated by an unsympathetic metaphysical court. You know, you get charge of sexual desire, you have custody of chess. You know, this was... Certainly neither Platonists, nor Aristotelians, nor Stoics, nor any of the Christian metaphysicians of late antiquity or the Middle Ages could have conceived of matter as something independent of spirit, to which spirit was something simply superadded in living beings. None of them certainly thought of either the body or the cosmos as a machine organized by rational force from beyond itself in a simple sense. They saw matter as being always already informed by indwelling rational causes and thus open to and in fact directed towards mind. And obviously neither Platonists nor Aristotelians nor Christians nor Hellenistic Jewish thinkers nor Muslim thinkers conceived of spirit as being immaterial in a privative sense, in the way that a vacuum is not aerial or a vapor not a solid. For them, the spirit was more substantial, more actual, more supereminently real than matter, the pervasive reality in which matter had to participate to be anything at all. So the quandaries produced by early modern dualism then, like the notorious interaction problem, for example, simply didn't exist because no school conceived of the interaction between soul and body as a purely extrinsic physical alliance between two disparate kinds of substance. It's important to emphasize that word physical. The material order is only, it could be assumed, an ontologically diminished or constricted effect of the fuller actuality of the spiritual order. Not even Platonic tradition, despite the tendency of contemporary Anglophone philosophers in many cases to equate it with Cartesianism, regarded the soul as a pure intellect presiding over the automaton of the body. Rather, it conceived of the soul as the body's life, spiritual and organic at once, comprising the appetites and passions no less than rational intellect, and saw the body as a material reflection of a rational and ideal order. Matter was not simply the inert and opaque matter of mechanistic thought, but rather a mirror of eternal splendors and verities, infinite potentiality, truly, if defectively, predisposed to the light of spirit. For Aristotelian tradition, the human soul was the form of the body, the very essence and nature of human beings' whole rational and animal organism, the formal and vital power animating, pervading, shaping every person, drawing all the energies of life into a living unity. For pagans, Hellenistic Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, the soul was the source and immanent entelechy of corporeal life, encompassing every dimension of human existence, animal functions, abstract intellect, sensation and reason, emotion and ratiocination, flesh and spirit, natural aptitude, and supernatural longing. If, however, I were to attempt to sum up the pre-modern understanding of the soul in a single gnomic formula that appeals to me, which I presupposes precisely what I'm about to do, so I don't really need to be so subjunctive about it. In order to sum it up in a single gnomic formula, I would say this: the soul, classically understood, ultimately coincides conceptually with existence itself. It is convertible with the very act of being, or rather, there is no such thing as the act of existence apart from the act of consciousness. And here's the point where I'm taking leave, I'm sorry, of the kind of arguments that are simply propositional, and I'm just describing the project as it will continue to take shape when I write it in the book. And here I'll be drawing to a great degree on figures as diverse as Husserl and Bernard Lonergan, but also Plotinus and certain Hindu thinkers like Ramanuja and others. But let me start by saying we've reached a curious juncture in the history of materialism, which seems to point towards a terminus either tragic or comic, depending on where your sympathies lie. For a number of naturalist theorists, it's become entirely credible. Read Daniel Dennett. And even logically inevitable that the defense of rationalistic values should require the denial of the existence of reason. Not that he'd put it that way. Or rather, intellectual consistency obliges them to believe that reason is parasitic upon purely irrational physical events, then it may well be the case that our non-existent consciousness is only deluded in intentionally believing that there's such a thing as intentional belief. Or they think that what we have mistaken for our rational convictions and ideas are actually only a colony of diverse memes that have established themselves in the ecologies of our cerebral cortices, or whatever. How that becomes a subjective, never mind. Modern materialism, it's only in a theory of mind, in philosophy of mind, where this becomes so evident, but modern materialism in some cases has reached a point of almost mystically fundamentalist absurdism on these points. But what's so astonishing here to me is not that some extreme proponents of naturalist thoughts venture such ideas, venture eliminativism. It's that any person of a naturalist bent could imagine that his or her beliefs permit any other conclusions. I mean, given how obdurately consciousness resists reduction to material causes, what reason is there, apart from devotion to the materialist catechism, for rejecting the more ancient intuition that the true order of ultimate causes is precisely the opposite of the materialist picture, and that the material realm is ultimately dependent upon mind rather than the reverse, say? I'm just giving a case here. I mean, what's the compelling logic? That the original actuality upon which all contingent beings depend, that is to say, is at the same time a limitless act of consciousness. What could we possibly imagine we know about matter or mind that could preclude such a possibility? We've no plausible causal model for how consciousness could arise from mechanistic physical processes. No reason at all to presume some sort of necessary dependency of mind upon matter. We know there's a close liaison in ourselves. Conversely, we have far better warrant for believing in mind than we do for believing even in matter itself. Of the material world, we have compelling evidence, of course, if you stub your toe, but it consists in mental impressions and conceptual paradigms produced by and inhabiting the prior reality of phenomenal, unified, intentional consciousness. Of consciousness itself, however, our knowledge is immediate and indubitable. And as I said, here I'm getting very abstract, but the argument in the book is a good 10-hour argument, and I think the game would be over by then. It's a very old metaphysical puzzle, whether being and consciousness are entirely severable concepts, for instance. Could something exist in such a manner that it could not be perceived or thought about in any way at all, not even by itself, even in principle, just to take a very old question? In what sense would it be distinct from absolute nothingness? It certainly seems reasonable to say that being is manifestation, that real subsistence is revelation, that to exist is to be perceptible, conceivable, knowable, and that, moreover, to exist fully is to be manifest to consciousness. If there were a universe in which consciousness did not exist, in what sense precisely would that universe itself exist? Certainly not as the fully articulated spatial, temporal reality filled with clearly discrete objects like the universe that exists in our minds and we find represented in our thoughts, in which intensities and densities and durations and successions are arranged in such magnificently complex but diverse order. This exists only relative to consciousness. At the phenomenal level, the level of reality as it appears to intentional awareness, nothing would exist at all. In itself, if it had any reality in itself, this mindless universe would be a plenum or totality of, I don't know, quantum potentialities. Extended, I put that in quotation remarks, relative only to one another, but in a way quite different from the kind of extension in space and time of which we could conceive. Even then, however, it seems fair to say that such a universe, if it existed, could exist exactly to the extent that it could be known to some kind of rational mind. There is no such thing as ontological coherence that is not a rational coherence. People notice the ghost of Bernard Lonergan wandering around in here. Sorry. There's a point then, arguably, at which being and intelligibility become conceptually indistinguishable. It's only as an intelligible order, as a coherent phenomenon, sensible or intellectual, that anything is anything at all, whether an elementary particle or a universe. Perhaps it's true that only what in principle can be known can in actuality exist, or so at any rate we have to believe. The rational desire to know the truth of things in every sphere is sustained by a tacit faith in some kind of ultimate coincidence or convertibility between being and consciousness. There is a natural orientation of the mind towards a horizon of total intelligibility, a natural intellectual appetite for immediate knowledge of what is that requires us to venture our time, our hopes, our labors, our contentions on the assumption that rational thought and coherent order are two sides of a single reality, or at least naturally fitted. If we believe that the structure of reality can truly be mirrored in the structure of our thinking, then we also must believe that there is an ideal or purely intelligible dimension of reality that really corresponds to the categories and concepts that allow us to understand the world. I guess it's what they called Lonergan's backward Platonism. But there's such a wonderful transparency of the world to thought, and a wonderful power of thought to interpret reality coherently through forms and principles of an entirely noetic nature, that we cannot help but believe that being in itself is, or at least conduct ourselves as if we believe it is pure intelligibility. So here's the world we experience. Two poles logically prior to the finite and identity of the impulses of the ego, the vanishing point of the mind's inner coherence and simplicity is met by the vanishing point of the world's highest values, that highest intelligibility. The gaze of the apperceptive eye within is turned towards a transcendent that which is forever beyond, and mental experience of the self or the world takes shape in the relation between these two extranatural poles. Consciousness contains nature as a complete and cogent reality because it has always preceded and exceeded nature. By their transcendence of all finite conditions, they give us a world. For me, at least at this point, the empirical self, the psychological individual, is itself, the way I think about it, only a part of nature as it occurs in the interval between these two transcendental poles. Prior to it is a unity that takes in reality through an orientation and ecstasy of the mind and will to the final cause of that horizon, of the infinite. The whole of what we call nature is what we know as the interval between two transcendental realities, the apperceptive unity of intentional consciousness and the teleological university of being as total intelligibility. And the logical and ontological priority of neither admits of a materialist solution, and yet the material order is constituted as an intelligible totality by the relation between them. And so the continuum is broken open at both ends. sorry, I'm getting very unworldly here, but I don't mean to. But it's just metaphysical conjecture. This, if you're moving just from the phenomenology of mind, and before you make the metaphysical move, you find that metaphysical conjecture beyond the empirical is not only licit, it's the very structure of thought, the primordial shape of all empirical knowledge. The phenomenal is already metaphysical. The very possibility of nature is a supernatural dispensation, supernatural. So if speaking in terms of knowledge, the foundation of intuition and conception is the necessary relation of intentional consciousness to the whole of being as its final end, it's only rational to ask whether this ordo cognoscendi is an inversion of the ordo ascendi. This order of knowledge is an inversion of the order of being, a glimpse of, speaking ontologically, transcendent being as the source and ground of consciousness. Now, however, let me say this. If world and mind really are open to one another in any way, then once more it seems we should accord a certain causal priority to mind over matter in our picture of reality. I'm nearly done, I promise. If the materialist understanding of nature were essentially correct, it would be difficult enough to account for the existence of consciousness, but far more difficult to say how consciousness, in all its exorbitant difference from the purposeless welter of physical causality, could actually capture the truth of physical reality in the exquisite trammels of its concepts. Yet it certainly seems that in abstracting experience into various kinds of ideal content, formal, mathematical, moral, aesthetic, and so on, the mind does indeed extract knowledge from what would otherwise be meaningless, brute events. And in fact, reality becomes more intelligible to us the more we're able to abstract it into concepts, to arrange it under categories, to arrange our concepts under simpler, more comprehensive, more unconditioned concepts. We're always trying to ascend towards the simplest, most capacious concept our minds can reach. That's why when we say that something has become intelligible to us, it means that we have an idea of it that can be understood according to the simplest abstract laws without leaving behind an empirical or conceptual remainder. That may just be an ideal of knowledge, but it's the one that we have to work with. And this being so, again, it makes perfect sense that so many ancient and medieval philosophers took it as a given that the ideal dimension of things, their intrinsic intelligibility, was not only a real property of their existence, but in some sense identical with that existence. What is an idea, however, other than the expression of a rational intentionality? And how, therefore, could being be pure intelligibility if it were not also pure intelligence, as Lonergan asks? It's okay to mention Lonergan here, right? Sometimes I talk in Dominican places and, beer bottles begin flying. Something has to be said for his famous argument that the unrestricted intelligibility of reality leads thought to God as the one unrestricted act of understanding. I'm not going to defend it here, but I will in the book. As the mind moves towards an ever more comprehensive and supereminent grasp of reality, it necessarily moves towards an ideal level at which intelligibility and intelligence are no longer indistinguishable, for what is the ideal other than the known? The mind can be a true mirror of objective reality because we assume that objective reality is already a mirror of mind. And the ascent towards ever greater knowledge is, if only tacitly and contre cœur, an ascent towards an ultimate encounter with limitless consciousness, limitless reason, a transcendent reality where being and knowledge are always already one and the same, and so inalienable from one another. So, back to my needless subjunctive. If I were looking for a definition of the soul that best describes where my project is going to end up, it would be something like a restricted instance of that unrestricted act. Like light captured in and refracted by a prism, being, or consciousness, expresses itself in the faceted finitude of our natures. But it is God in himself who is the logical order of all reality. See, You pull back the veil, theology emerges again. The ground both of the subjective rationality of mind and the objective rationality of being, the transcendent and indwelling reason or wisdom by which mind and matter are both informed and in which both participate. If indeed to exist is to be manifest, as I said above, to be intelligible and perceptible, and if to exist fully is to be consciously known, then God as infinite being is also an act of infinite knowledge. He is in himself the absolute unity of consciousness and being, and so in the realm of contingent things, the source of the fittedness of consciousness and being, each to the other, the one ontological reality of reason, as it exists both in thought and in the structure of the universe. Thus, when one looks inward towards that vanishing point of unity that makes the whole of mental life possible, one looks, as all contemplative traditions insist, towards the source and ground of the mind, the simplicity of God, the one ground of both consciousness and being. More inward to consciousness than consciousness itself is that light that imparts life and truth to the soul, and the mind's interior journey towards its own wellspring brings it to a place where it finds itself utterly dependent upon the sublime simplicity of God's knowledge of all things in his knowledge of himself. And thus also when one looks outward towards the world, one looks towards that same source, that same unity of being and intelligibility. So whether one looks outward or inward, the soul looks upon the soul, or to say the same thing from the opposite angle, being looks upon being. And thus, in either case, one encounters God in his self-disclosure. Thank you. I think that's what they call covering too much ground. Anyway.
We're going to take a 5-minute stretch break and then return for questions.
still mad at him. Nah, he didn't let me go to my friend's wedding. I can't remember. We were mad at each other for something. He was in charge, so he didn't let me go. I think it's the Virginia Tech game.
We're going to resume in about a minute, about 1 more minute. Okay, we're going to resume now, so please take your seats. So now we'd like to invite anyone who has a question relevant to tonight's topic. Or to the playoffs. To come up to the microphone right here, to step up, stand in a line behind the microphone, and a little bit of etiquette. We ask that your question, of course, be respectful, that it not be a comment, but a question. We ask that you limit yourself to one question, so others have a chance to ask a question. We ask that you not stand and ask a follow-up question for the same reason, although you may stay there if Dr. Hart wants to ask a clarification of your question. So, let the games begin.
Martin Ahierber, Diocese of Tyler, third year theology. I want to take you to the African world where...
Okay.
where...
I mean, really, can we go on a trip?
Where reality is not one or many, where it's neither one nor many, where we don't have problem with polarity, one against the other, or the binary polarity. So my question will be, what is the relationship between consciousness and myth?
And myth?
Yeah, see, we have been struggling in trying to say whether we could go beyond materiality or whether we could go beyond the empirical facts. And do you think there's a sacredness in secularity, or
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
Sacredness, like
Sacredness.
secularity or materiality.
With materiality. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's two questions, actually, so I think you broke the rule right off the bat. Yes. My favorite living English philosopher, Stephen R.L. Clarke, has written some wonderful things about the relationship of consciousness and myth, and I endorse them all. Is that good enough? No. But, yeah, no, I mean, he wrote, for instance, this isn't about myth, but he wrote one of my favorite essays of philosophical essays of the past 100 years called How to Believe in Fairies. And it seems like a facetious title, but he was making a point about the phenomenon, the world of consciousness that we inhabit, in which, say, sort of like the mechanistic picture of nature is only a local region, and obviously one that in its own right commands no more claim on our credulity than the dream worlds or the worlds of myth or other states of consciousness that reveal. But again, I'm as a instinctive, just basic, average Neoplatonist, semi-Vedantic, Madhyamaka, sort of Taoist Christian. You meet them everywhere. I'm disposed to think that way anyway, But no, I think actually that's a great question. The problem is I think it's such a subtle question that I don't know if I could answer it in a good way. But I will direct you to Stephen R.L. Clarke, and I am planning to write on that issue when I can, as it happens, if I can think of something to add to what he's already said. I do think that there's a sacred dimension in everything. The secular world, though, is a particular narrative. It's not if you mean the material world, yes. If you mean the secular world, that's a more difficult question because secularity is an historical narrative which carries with it a metaphysics that in some sense doesn't reinscribe the ancient division between the sacred and the profane, but rather between the false, the supernaturalist, and the empirical, which is not a realm of the sacred in any sense. So, yes, definitely the material. All things are charged with the glory of God, but the secular as an historical narrative, I don't want to force them. I don't want to, say, you really believe in God, you don't just know it. Seems to me an arrogant, I mean, it's true, but it's really arrogant of me to say it. So,
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up on your comment about Dennett and your statement that he's not going to come right out and say it, but logic as we define it doesn't really exist because eventually we're going to figure out a way to reduce it materially and understand how all the physical realities of the brain are working together to get these logical conclusions, if I understood you correctly. Yeah. So my question would be, you have a somewhat skeptical view of the future, it seems, of materialist kind of theory as far as brain activity goes. My question would be, how would you respond to somebody like Dennett, who I would assume would say to you, well, we just haven't figured it all out yet. We're still going to be working on this. We just haven't figured out how these complex neurons are interacting to create these phenomena. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's the promissory note, that we will get there. The problem is that the claim is based on a logical fallacy to begin with, which is that we're asking the same questions. And in one sense, Dennett knows we're not. The reason he denies the existence of consciousness, he's not a straight eliminativist in the Paul and Patricia Churchland mold, but that's his nuclear option. He leaves it on as an, if all other ways of getting around supernaturalism fail, that remains. The reason he denies the reality of consciousness is simply that he recognizes that if you were to grant it its at least phenomenological profile and what it seems to be doing, then you are talking about something that falls outside of any material narrative, but also outside a third-person account. It's a very odd position he takes. It's that science requires a third-person narrative, and since subjectivity can't be subjected to a third-person narrative directly, in itself it doesn't have an intrinsic existence. So the method now becomes the metaphysical ground for determinations of what can and cannot exist. It's a mistake. The notion that cognitive science, at least what we mean by cognitive science, is ever going to yield a science of consciousness is simply a confusion of categories. What cognitive science can tell us is a great deal of, well, let me give you an example. You know, Francis Crick got interested in consciousness in later years. And he used to teach a course on consciousness, and a public course, and a woman asked him, she just couldn't figure out what the problem was. And he said, well, what do you think goes on when you experience things, when you have intuitions or representations or whatever? And she just said, I always assume that inside the brain there's something like a little television. He said, yeah, but who's watching the television? Okay. Cognitive science, as it exists now, is an examination of the structure of the television. It tells us a great deal about the mechanics of how impressions are formed or retained as electrical events. It tells us nothing, and it can tell us nothing about intentional, unified consciousness as a phenomenal act, as a phenomenologically describable act, and yet we all possess it. And by constantly trying to, again, my cognitive science friends just don't always see the distinction. Dennett does see the distinction, and that's why he has to suggest that in some sense consciousness doesn't really exist. This is illusion. It's the way we talk about the intentional stance. How you can talk about having an intentional stance without real intentionality, I don't know. And it's deeply, it's deeply confused. Now, this is the last thing I'll say, and then we'll move on to the next question. A good example of this, of the way Dennett often proceeds with these questions, I think it's in Consciousness Explained, where he's arguing that private consciousness, qualitative consciousness, qualia, are not intrinsic. They're not just first person. They have to be they're actually third person physical events. And the way he argues this is that, say you like a particular brand of coffee, and then you stop liking it. Well, have you changed or has the coffee changed? Well, you would need a third person to give you an objective account of either your taste buds or the coffee. Well, he's just switched from the question of the existence of consciousness to the question of epistemology. The question isn't whether my consciousness is an accurate reflection of the world out there or not. The question is how this event, consciousness, whether correct or deluded, could exist at all. And again, his work just repeats that same shift, that same almost dealing with the question and then shifting to another one. So.
Thank you, Dr. Hart, for being with us tonight.
Bottom of the ninth now.
Fortunately, you were kind of just venturing towards my question, so it should be maybe a little shorter answer because of that. But you mentioned your frustration specifically of working with cognitive scientists.
But not all of them. Some of them.
Yeah.
In case any are watching. I love you, James.
But you also, of course,
You're a
spoke of
genius.
benefiting from working with academics such as them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they
it's-
ask fascinating questions.
Yeah.
So.
It's clear to me that the cognitive scientists hurt themselves by ignoring the traditional philosophical view of the soul, etc. But it also seems to me that the philosophical understanding of the soul could benefit from some of the discoveries in cognitive science or the thought of cognitive science. So what is the relationship between cognitive science and this area of philosophical study that is, the philosophy of the mind, of the consciousness, of the soul, and can they beneficially inform each other? And if so, what's necessary to cross that gap there?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are 1,000 ways. I mean, first of all, the advances in cognitive science and neuroscience are fascinating. And some of the things they've discovered about regions of the brain weren't even imaginable just a decade ago. one thing I think that emerges from this is that the Cartesian picture is just silly I mean, it's silly to cling to that at all. Because have you ever heard of Paul and Patricia Churchland before? Do you know her?
Maybe.
Okay. Well, if Patricia Churchland is defending eliminativism, she always understands the only alternative to be Cartesianism. She's literally unaware that there are other understandings of the relation of body and soul. I think, also questions of rational function can, for instance, I know a lot of people at NDIAS and at Notre Dame. I met a lot of people who work with animal cognition and animal function, and they're all quite clear on the vast difference between humans and animals, but at the same time, a lot of their findings call into question the kind of neat, absolute partition between sensible and rational that's, say, part of kind of the more doctrinaire Thomistic school of thinking about mind, that they have to think in a subtler way here. Still, all that said, it is the case that in some sense we're asking two different questions, and so it's never going to be the case that one is going to be decisive for the other. I mean, a phenomenology of consciousness should not affect a neuroscientist's search for the correlations between certain brain activities and certain responses. But neither should a neuroscientist's interest in integrated information theory and trying to come up with the quantum of phi, conscious. That should never, ever, ever be allowed to distract philosophers of mind from what the question of consciousness really is. And in the Anglophone world, that's a real danger, because people in analytic philosophy so often are so anxious to seem scientifically on the cutting edge. There is this sort of science envy in some quarters of the analytic world. You also want to keep the lines of demarcation there, so you understand these are not the same question. Thank you.
Dr. Hart, thank you for coming here and really bringing to light these questions. I guess the question I had was, so you made kind of a demarcation between the kind of last 400 years of epistemological and cognitive work that begins with Descartes, and you made a contrast with the ancient world and its appeal to the soul and its understanding in many of the different schools. But we know that the modern materialists draw from the atomist school, Democritus and so on and so forth, as rivals of Aristotle and Plato, and in many ways that there was a constant battle in the ancient world, if you will. And
one that's often misrepresented, however, but yeah.
Right, and I guess what I wanted to touch on is in your work. It seems when the Daniel Dennett's and the Pinkers and the others bring up the arguments, they think it only begins with Descartes, and I'm thinking of like Richard Popkin's work that would bring forward that there is this entire tradition of materialism and skepticism that are tied together. And how do you respond to? I mean, in other words, I think one way to respond to them is historically, that they're pulling from a tradition and they're pulling those assumptions from the traditions, then to build upon their scientific work. I mean, are you kind of taking them on? I guess both in just the historical kind of, and I'm thinking like McIntyre's way of understanding tradition theory, that they're pulling, almost assuming a tradition and trying to use that as a basis of sounding scientific, as you say.
I'm not entirely sure I follow everything you're asking, but I think I get the general drift. I'll say this. What my experience is what most of them are unaware of is the difference between metaphysics and method. The reason they tend to be confined to a modern view of the matter is that they're thinking in terms of matter as mechanism. Right. Now, the atomists don't exactly do this because they don't have a sense of mechanism in that sense. And they're concerned with how the appearance of purpose can arise from a purposeless process. Now, in that degree, in that sense, they are in line with the atomists. But they're specifically concerned with mechanism. And the point of this is, of course, they are inheritors of the early modern notion of, ideal of a purely inductive science and nature viewed as a machine for inductive purposes. If you just, you prescind from any notion of final or formal causes and can concentrate entirely on functions, then you can inductively arrive at an understanding. Now, of course, pure induction is a fantasy. It can't be done. You always start with questions that are proposive. And that being the case, you can never get to a place where you've actually discovered anything apart from the question of purpose. But then as a metaphysical gesture, you can say, but that's just that's a façon de parler, in point of fact. There is no purpose. This is just the epiphenomenal residue of purposeless forces. How you would know that then, however, when your method can never get past the question is another issue. But having that as their method, in the background, we know the history of modern thought in this regard. What began as method became a metaphysics, because the ambition of the new science to control and understand nature also had within it the ambition to know everything that can be known. Laplace, if I just, a mind with sufficient information about the disposition of all particles and all the history of the, And so the method, which should be nothing more than a kind of bracketing out of certain questions so you can concentrate on it, now becomes a metaphysics, and what does not conform to the mechanistic narrative is by definition false. The problem is, okay, you've set yourself, and it's funny actually, I talk about Dennett, but it's true of a lot of them. They're thoroughly mechanistic. I mean, and, it's as if, in about everything, it's as if they've never even heard of quantum mechanics or, or they're mechanistic about molecular biology, about physics, about everything. Consciousness does not suffer description in mechanistic terms. It is, as a phenomenological act, not only intentional, it is intentionality right through. It is teleology. It is final causality from beginning to end. It doesn't have any non-teleological element in it. And so they have to find a way of accounting within a mechanistic narrative for the very thing, subjective, intentional, unified, that what they want is something that's objective, non-intentional, plural, composite, and describable entirely in third-person terms. No such, that's never going to happen, So they're bound to a metaphysical premise. Think of it, it is a modern premise, it's mechanistic, but you're right, in terms, in other terms, and it's just sheer emergentism, it is foreshadowed in the atomist tradition, in Epicureanism. Yeah.
Hi, thanks again for sharing your insights. If I leave here with a small percentage, I'll be richer for it.
Thank you.
Yes.
And the Dodgers won.
That's good.
So go on.
I'll try.
Sorry.
Guys.
I'm just getting these messages from, I have too many friends.
It's a hard problem to have, I know.
We never really leave high school,
So, my experience has been that
our wives do. Sorry.
my question has to do with consciousness and awareness. And in my experience, I can come to try to know a lot of facts about a thing, but not necessarily grow in charity or become a better human being. And so I wanted to ask you about the connection, as you see, between a kind of intellectual awareness or deep understanding of a thing from the aspect of truth and the relationship of consciousness and being.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I did I doubt if I did a very good job hiding my somewhat Platonic tendencies. I do believe in an ultimate coincidence of these transcendental orientations of consciousness, so that it's impossible truly to know without the impulse, without love. I mean, really, honestly, I mean, this is and impossible to love without knowledge, obviously. That the nearer one comes to an appreciation of the transcendental orientation of the mind's intentions, the more you realize that the good, which is the end of the movement of the mind, and the light that clarifies what you know as you approach it, is as much a moral as an intellectual discipline. You can't separate those two things. And if you try to, you end up with a kind of diabolistic view of knowledge in which it's simply power and control of what's near at hand. And in that very way, fail to know it for what it is in itself. It becomes an implement of your will rather than a revelation to your heart. So, I mean, I think that I'm very much in that tradition that believes firmly that the moral discipline of charity and the intellectual discipline of seeking the truth for its own sake more and more coincide and converge as the mind ascends towards what is real. But again, it's such a deep question, and I'm afraid I can't really do it justice in 2 or 3 minutes. So, read Gregory of Nyssa. That's my advice to everyone. So,
we have I thought this might be fun. We have a viewer in Norway.
Is it my brother?
Is he from Norway?
My brother lives in Norway. Yeah.
Username Newt Jonas.
No. I don't have any newts in my family. No, Canutes.
His English is a little rough, but I thought since he was from Norway, I would ask this. He's asking, since modern psychology is materialistic, at least much of it, does it risk becoming something hurtful rather than healing in our society? So he's, I guess, delving into psychology in terms of being materialistic in its method and being a dangerous practice. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does, actually. I mean, I think actually in practical terms it sometimes does, in others not. I mean, one of the advances that is perhaps an advance in psychology is the recognition that a lot of things that, say, Freud treated as emotional pathologies were problems of brain chemistry. So there's nothing wrong with knowing that. As again, there's a lot to be learned from the mechanistic approach as long as it doesn't become a metaphysics. On the other hand, and this is, there's a wonderful book by philosopher and theologian Jeff Bishop, who's also a doctor, called The Anticipatory Corpse. And he's talking about the way modern medicine treats the body, rather than as an organic living system with an imminent, but rather simply as a collection of physical functions, so that, you have people who are under treatment receiving 30 different pharmaceuticals, balancing each other out, trying to get the body treated as a machine, can do as much damage sometimes as, instead of change the way you live. In a lot of the practice of clinical psychology today, the assumption that we're just machines that need to be corrected, rather than living souls that need to be healed, does lead to practices that are destructive, to certain pharmaceutical solutions, pharmacological solutions that do more harm than good, a freewheeling willingness to use experimental pharmaceuticals whose ultimate effects we don't understand. So yeah, I do think that the problem of treating, the problem of treating the human being as a set of mechanistic functions that can be adjusted or corrected by the application of the right mechanical correctives can do considerable harm. And psychologists, have a lot of power. Okay, one more question. Yeah.
I didn't mean to stop you from.
No. I was trying to look at him. He's very beautiful.
Oh.
Well, as these things go.
I mean, that can lead you right up the ladder, right?
Right,
the
that's
first
right,
one.
yeah.
I'm not going to get your language quite right here.
Alcibiades to God.
Exactly.
You know, sorry. Sorry.
You asked what the, and again, I'm not going to get your language quite right here, so maybe you can correct me if I miss an important distinction. But you asked what motivation there is left to resist the ancient intuition that matter rather is dependent on mind, that it flows that way rather than the other way.
Well, yeah, why do we assume that that's the more rational alternative when throughout most of human intellectual cultural history, the opposite assumption has seemed more intuitively correct and seems better to accord with the problems.
Right.
Yeah.
I suppose what pulls me persistently in that direction, while acknowledging that there's several very powerful and seemingly unanswerable challenges, is that we do have this account of natural history now that's hooked up to all kinds of other realms of knowledge and sort of practical knowledge, technology, right? You know, stuff we know it's true in some sense because it works. Where, mind is quite late. That it's late.
Well, we don't.
I mean, you can.
I was talking about God's mind ultimately.
Sure,
I assume that was there originally.
There's
but,
mind,
yeah,
right? But even
yeah.
if you bring that in to say that there is sort of mind originally, so there is mind before, but then at some point you have these little minds, right? Our minds. So unless you have a kind of infusion,
there were others
of
before
something.
ours, but yeah. So right. I mean,
Are we talking about angels or apes?
I was talking about animals and rutabagas, actually.
Okay.
But I just mean that we're not the only conscious beings in nature.
Sure.
So right, but go on. Yeah.
I suppose that's just what sort of continuously pulls me, is that even if I do help myself to an idea of, eternal mind, God, I still have to account for where it comes in later, as it were. Like there was mind in the there was no mind in the material universe, and there was.
I mentioned. Well, I wouldn't say that, but yeah, not mind as we understand it, certainly. But again, because time is short, I'll again recommend an essay by Stephen R.L. Clark in his collection, I think, From Athens to Jerusalem. It's called "Could or Can Consciousness Evolve?" And it's a brilliant meditation on just that question. And actually, I think just his answers are ingenious. But I don't see that as a problem, because my claim about the structure of reality inhabiting mind, inhabiting consciousness, doesn't change the fact that it inhabits consciousness as a history, as a natural history, as well as a present experience of the universe. The problem remains, do minds appear in nature as emergent phenomena of physical processes? The logic of that is so difficult to make coherent. Or does nature become capable of conscious life at an ever higher degree, and consciousness is in some sense already there? And the latter seems to me, and the Clark essay is a wonderful argument, the latter can be argued with much more coherence. It doesn't seem to me a problem. But maybe if I think about why that would have that affective consequence for you, it might give me something to think about. So thank you very much for having me here. And
Thank you so much, Dr. Hart, for being here tonight. I have to say that I think tonight's lecture made my own brain sweat. And I'm very grateful for that. Catholics, in their better moments, love good, careful, and honest thinking. And tonight was a marvelous example of that. And Dr. Hart's work as a whole is a stupendous example of that. And we're grateful for the labors you put into that over the years. Tonight, to end in prayer, I'd like to invite everyone to please stand and join me. And the seminarians will know the Latin Salve Regina, hymn to Our Lady on this Feast of the Holy Rosary. So I will try to intone that, and we'll end tonight by invoking her. Salve Regina. Thank you all for coming tonight, and God bless you.